Let's bring you this now. There's an increase in workplace absenteeism leading to workers being fired for desertion. A case at the CCMA between the SABC and a staffer has highlighted this particular issue. The employee was dismissed, but later on the decision was reversed and he was orally instructed to return. Now, he was, however, waiting for a written instruction and was subsequently fired for desertion. The CCMA found in the workers' favour. So let's get more on this from Labour law expert Osborne Molatudi, who joins me now to take this discussion even further. Osborne, good morning to you and thank you so much for your time. I think before we get into this case and how recent increases show quite a significance in how this problem seems to be increasing, just define for us what desertion actually means.
Is when an employee does not intend to return to work and that employee acts in breach of a contract that he or she signed with the employer, that he or she will avail his or her services for that employer. So if someone disappears with no intention to return to the workplace, that's definitely a desertion. However, there's another aspect referred to as AWOL, that's absence without leave. That's the one where the employee either takes leave and does not return on a particular day, or the employee just disappeared but has an intention to return to work, but he's doing the disappearance without permission from the employer. So those are the basic principle insofar as the employee's absenteeism from work is concerned.
Right. Is desertion easy or difficult for an employer to prove?
I think from a layman perspective, it is easy to prove, because if one acts in breach of a contract, we can easily conclude that that person has got no intention to make his or her services available to the employer. However, it's not as easy as one would think from a labor law perspective, because the employer is still expected to follow what one can call a due and fair process. In other words, send reminders to that employee to say, why are you not at work? Come to work. If you don't come to work by this date, then we will regard your absence as desertion or abscondment.
In this instance where, of course, I've just narrated the incident between the SABC and a staffer, where it seems the employee had been told or instructed orally to come back to work, but the employee was waiting for a written instruction. I mean, how difficult in that sense or easy could it have been for the SABC to prove desertion?
I think in that instance, SABC will have to demonstrate that the employee is playing what one can call a difficult game. An instruction does not need to be in writing. An instruction can be oral. An instruction can be sent by text. An instruction can be sent in any other means, as long as the employee is aware of the employer's instruction to return to work. So I believe that that employee was, as I indicated, was simply playing a difficult game. You must remember, when you sign a contract to say, I will be availing myself to do work for certain times during days of a particular week. Now, once you're absent and the employer sends you reminders, either orally or in writing, surely that cannot be compliance with that contract of employment, and the employer will perfectly within its rights to consider terminating that employee's employment after it had followed a due process.
Yeah, and let's talk about that due process, because it's quite important to understand, Osborne. What process then does the employer follow before they finally terminate your contract?
Normally, the employer would be expected to have a disciplinary inquiry. But in the case where an employee has absconded or being absent without leave, all what the employer is required to do is to send the instructions, reminders to that employee, and putting that employee on terms and clearly indicating that if that employee does not return to work by a particular date, then that employee's absence can be regarded as repudiation, and the employer can indicate that the repudiation of the contract of employment will then be accepted from its perspective. And on that basis, the employer can still argue that there is no dismissal, because all what the employee has done was simply to repudiate the contract, be absent from work, and not even heed the reminders and instructions that are sent to him or her by the employer.
Now, is there a fine line between extended absenteeism and desertion? Can an employee in their argument say, no, this was just nothing more but an extended absenteeism?
If the employee responds to the employer's request to return to work and say, I am on extended leave, then that employee will be expected to demonstrate that he or she has permission from the employer. So there is a fine line. Desertion is simply where you don't respond to the employer's reminders. You don't do anything. You don't avail yourself. That's a clear-cut desertion. But where you begin to respond, it means you are on an extended leave. Then the next inquiry will be whether or not you do have the permission from the employer to be on an extended leave. If you do not have the permission, the employer will then be entitled to institute an inquiry against you for being absent from work without authorization. As I said, AWOL.
Yeah. Just in my last question to you, Osborne, because I think, it's important for employees to understand, labor, law policies, particularly in the workplace. In your work, do you see a rising increase in a lot of employees being fired for desertion, in even understanding what desertion is, or perhaps being on these, non-explained extended leaves and then finding themselves in these situations whereby they run the risk of having them dismissed?
Indeed. In fact, our firm has handled a particular unique case where the employee disappeared and later on said to the employer that he was on some traditional sojourn. But all along, the employer has been communicating with him and his wife. And unfortunately, his wife contradicted his version at the CCMA. But he won the case, but on review, the labor court was sympathetic to the employer's cause, because you can only do so much as an employer to chase after an employee who has signed a contract with you to avail his or her services to you. So there are those instances where the employee do disappear without giving any reasons to the employer. In some instances, and this is my own personal assessment, employees who engage in those kind of acts are actually moonlighting. So they have other work outside of the employer, so they're unable to balance, or they have simply lost interest, or maybe they have won a jackpot and they're no longer interested to return to work, or even to notify the employers. But others, they do so. They disappear for valid reasons where they're unable to communicate those reasons with the employer. For instance, if one is undergoing a traditional training to be a traditional healer, etc. Yeah. So those are the kind of circumstances and challenges that face employers in evaluating whether or not to dismiss the employee under those circumstances.
I think the message you're trying to say in Osborne is that even if you hit the jackpot, still communicate with your employer and just announce that you might be making your way out soon. But thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. Labour law expert Osborne Molatudi. We appreciate your time this morning.